Imagine a single gunshot echoing through the streets of Sarajevo. A moment so brief, so ordinary in sound, yet powerful enough to rip apart empires and plunge the world into its deadliest war. This is the story of how one assassination became the spark that set Europe, and eventually the world, on fire. Welcome to our journey through the First World War. In this episode, we'll uncover how fragile alliances, political rivalries, and one fateful day in 1914 transformed the destiny of nations. Stick with us to the very end, because understanding the beginning of World War I is the key to understanding how our modern world was shaped. If you love history, this is where the story begins. The dawn of the 20th century was a paradox. On one hand, it was an age of innovation, of electricity lighting up city streets, of new machines that promised to shrink distance and time. On the other, it was an age of rival empires, each bristling with armies and fleets, suspicious of their neighbors and bound together by treaties that promised protection, but also threatened catastrophe if the balance of power shifted. Europe, in 1914, was a continent divided not just by geography, but by ambition. The British Empire ruled the seas, boasting colonies from India to Africa. France, though scarred by defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, still clung fiercely to its honor and its overseas possessions. Germany, young and powerful, was hungry to prove itself as the new giant on the block, eager for recognition, for territory, for respect. Austria-Hungary, a fading empire stitched together from many restless nationalities, fought desperately to hold itself together. And Russia, vast, slow, yet formidable, stood as both protector and oppressor of the Slavic peoples. Into this volatile mix, add the most dangerous ingredient of all: nationalism. Across the Balkans, small nations dreamed of independence, of throwing off the old empires and writing their own destiny. Serbia, in particular, saw itself as the champion of the Slavs and a thorn in the side of Austria-Hungary. By 1914, the Balkans had already been called the powder keg of Europe. Twice in the years just before the Great War, regional wars erupted there. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty, had lost most of its European lands, leaving a vacuum that Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and others scrambled to fill. Each victory, each defeat, only fueled greater tensions. And above it all loomed the fear that any spark in the Balkans could draw in the great powers themselves, bound by treaties and pride to take sides. That spark came on June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, traveled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, angering Serbia and fueling nationalist resentment among Bosnian Serbs who dreamed of union with their Slavic brothers. For the Archduke, the visit was a matter of duty, a demonstration of imperial authority. But for Serbian nationalists, it was an insult and an opportunity. Among them was a secret society known as the Black Hand. Dedicated to the cause of a greater Serbia, they plotted an assassination that, they hoped, would strike a blow against Austrian domination. As Franz Ferdinand's motorcade wound its way through the streets, armed conspirators waited. One threw a bomb, which missed the Archduke's car but injured others. Shaken but determined to continue, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded at the hospital. Fate, however, had other plans. On a wrong turn, the Archduke's car stalled just yards away from a young assassin named Gavrilo Princip. Seizing the chance, Princip stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck Franz Ferdinand. The other hit his wife, Sophie. Within moments, both were dying. A single gunshot had found its mark, and in doing so, it unleashed forces far greater than anyone on that Sarajevo street could have imagined. In Vienna, the assassination was seen not merely as a crime, but as a challenge to imperial authority. Austria-Hungary, already wary of Serbian nationalism, viewed Serbia as complicit. And behind every decision stood Germany, Austria's closest ally, ready to offer what became known as the blank check of support. In Belgrade, Serbia braced itself, knowing that its protector, Russia, would not let it stand alone. Thus began a diplomatic crisis that spiraled out of control. In the weeks that followed, telegrams flew between capitals, ultimatums were drafted, and old rivalries resurfaced with terrifying speed. But why did one assassination escalate so quickly? Why did the great powers, instead of stepping back, march forward into war? The answer lies in the web of alliances that have been spun across Europe, and the mistrust that made backing down impossible. And so, the stage was set. The gunshots in Sarajevo had been fired, but it was the treaties, promises, and ambitions of nations that would turn those bullets into a global war. In the next part, we'll unravel how Europe's alliance system dragged the entire continent into conflict, and why compromise became impossible. The weeks following the assassination in Sarajevo are known to history as the July Crisis, a month-long descent from tragedy to war. It began with grief, but it ended with armies mobilizing and borders burning. To understand how it all happened, we must look closely at the fragile balance of alliances that bound Europe together and ultimately tore it apart. Austria-Hungary, reeling from the murder of its heir, wanted revenge. But revenge alone was not enough. The empire was a patchwork of nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and more, and each challenge to its authority risked unraveling the delicate threads that held it together. Serbian nationalism was not just an irritant. It was an existential threat. If Serbia could defy Vienna, then others within the empire might do the same. The Austro-Hungarian leadership decided that Serbia must be punished, decisively and publicly. But Austria-Hungary was no longer the powerful force it once had been. It needed reassurance that should Russia come to Serbia's defense, it would not be left isolated. That reassurance came from Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II, eager to support his ally and confident in Germany's strength, offered what became known as the blank check. Germany pledged unconditional support to Austria-Hungary, whatever course of action it chose. In doing so, Germany believed it was acting firmly but rationally, expecting that a show of strength would cow Serbia and deter Russia. Instead, the blank check emboldened Austria-Hungary to act recklessly. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. The demands were severe: suppress anti-Austrian propaganda, dissolve nationalist organizations, allow Austrian officials to participate in investigations on Serbian soil. For any sovereign nation, such terms would have been humiliating. For Serbia, it was a near impossible choice: accept domination or face war. Serbia, desperate to avoid conflict, yet unwilling to surrender its independence, gave a carefully crafted reply. It accepted most demands, but balked at those that would strip away its sovereignty. It was a response designed to appear conciliatory, but Vienna had already made up its mind. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The spark had become a flame. Russia, bound by cultural and political ties to the Slavic peoples, could not stand idle. Tsar Nicholas II authorized the mobilization of the Russian army. This decision was not taken lightly. Mobilization in 1914 was not a symbolic act. It was a logistical juggernaut, a massive and irreversible commitment. To mobilize was to prepare for war, and in the eyes of Germany, Russia's mobilization was a direct threat. Germany responded swiftly. On August 1, 1914, it declared war on Russia. And because France was Russia's ally, Germany prepared for the inevitable two-front war. But Germany had a plan. That plan was the Schlieffen Plan, a bold, almost mechanical strategy designed to avoid the nightmare of fighting both France and Russia simultaneously. The idea was simple: knock out France quickly by invading through Belgium, then turn eastward to face Russia. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it would draw Britain into the war and ensure that the conflict expanded far beyond Germany's original intentions. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The following day, German troops crossed into neutral Belgium. For Britain, this was the breaking point. Britain was not bound to defend France directly, but it was a guarantor of Belgian neutrality. The violation of Belgium's sovereignty was not just a treaty issue. It was a matter of national honor. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. In less than 2 weeks, Europe had descended into chaos. What began as an act of terrorism in Sarajevo had unleashed a chain reaction of alliances and obligations, dragging nation after nation into the abyss. And so the map of Europe became a battlefield. On one side stood the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. On the other stood the Allies, Russia, France, Britain, Serbia, Belgium, and eventually many others, including the United States. But in those first fateful days of August 1914, no one could yet imagine how long the war would last, how many would die, or how profoundly it would change the world. Many believed it would be short. Over by Christmas, they said. Soldiers marched off with flowers in their rifles and cheers in their ears, convinced they would return in glory. They could not know that they were walking into 4 years of trenches, gas, and slaughter on an industrial scale. The alliances had worked exactly as designed, and yet disastrously. Each nation believed it was acting defensively, that it had no choice but to honor its obligations, to protect its allies, to preserve its power. But in the process, they had set the stage for one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Let us pause here and look closer at the alliances themselves, the tangled web that turned a Balkan crisis into a world war. The Triple Alliance, formed in the late 19th century, bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy together. Though Italy would later switch sides, at the war's outset, this alliance meant that Germany was committed to backing Austria-Hungary. Opposing them was the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. It was less formal than the Triple Alliance, but it created a powerful counterweight. These blocs were not just military pacts. They were psychological chains, making every government fearful of appearing weak, fearful of losing prestige, fearful of betrayal. Germany's support for Austria-Hungary was rooted not only in alliance but also in strategy. German leaders feared encirclement, the possibility of fighting Russia in the east and France in the west. Supporting Austria was a way to keep its southern flank secure. France, still nursing the wound of losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in 1871, was eager for any chance to weaken its rival. Russia, though slow to mobilize, felt the weight of its role as the protector of Slavs. Britain, initially hesitant, could not allow German dominance of the continent or the violation of Belgian neutrality. Each decision made sense in isolation, but together they formed a trap from which there was no escape. The July crisis is often described as a tragedy of miscalculation. Leaders did not seek a world war. Most did not even believe it possible. Yet their actions, ultimatums, mobilizations, declarations piled upon one another until the momentum was unstoppable. In the language of the time, it was called the slide into war. But was it truly inevitable? That question has haunted historians ever since. Some argue that the alliances made war unavoidable, that Europe was a powder keg waiting for a match. Others suggest that stronger leadership, more patience, or clearer communication might have contained the crisis. What is certain is that once the machinery of mobilization began, there was little room for diplomacy. Armies were timetables, railroads, and logistics. To stop them was to risk vulnerability, and no nation dared to be the first to blink. And so, by early August 1914, the Great War had begun. But to truly grasp the weight of this moment, we must look beyond the headlines and treaties. We must enter the minds of those who marched, those who cheered, and those who trembled at what was coming. In final part, we'll explore the atmosphere across Europe, the jubilation, the fear, and the illusions that would soon be shattered in the mud of the trenches. Across Europe, as declarations of war were read aloud, crowds surged into the streets. Bells rang, flags waved, and in city squares, young men volunteered in droves. To many, war seemed not like a burden, but like an adventure. Decades of peace had dulled the memory of real conflict, and for a generation raised on stories of honor and glory, war seemed like the stage upon which to prove themselves. In Berlin, crowds cheered the Kaiser. In Paris, men sang the Marseillaise as they marched off to enlist. In London, posters declared, "Your country needs you," and tens of thousands responded. Even in small towns and villages, the excitement was palpable. Teachers, clerks, farmers, students, all lined up to take their oath. They expected a swift campaign, a test of courage, and a homecoming by Christmas. But beneath the cheers lurked unease. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers clasped their sons' shoulders with pride, but also with dread. The older generation knew that war was no game, that modern weapons promised horrors beyond imagination. Some leaders, too, recognized the danger. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey, watching the gas lamps being lit in London as war broke out, famously said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." As the trains carried soldiers to the front, Europe stood on the brink of transformation. Millions would soon find themselves in trenches, facing machine guns, barbed wire, and shells that rained down without mercy. The old world of kings and empires, of honor and parades, was already crumbling, though few realized it. The alliances had done their work. What had begun as a local act of violence, a young man with a pistol on a Sarajevo street, had become a world war. Not because of destiny, but because of choices. Choices made by emperors, ministers, generals, and diplomats, each believing they acted in defense of their nation, their pride, their honor. And yet the cost would be borne not by them, but by millions of ordinary people. Men sent to fight, women left to grieve, children growing up in a world where death and loss were everywhere. This was the spark that changed the world. And so ends the first chapter of the Great War. A single gunshot in Sarajevo had torn open the fabric of Europe, unleashing a chain reaction that no one could control. But this was only the beginning. The trenches, the battles, the sacrifices, all lay ahead. If this story has gripped you, if you want to understand not just the battles, but the human cost, then join us for the next episode, where we'll step into the mud and blood of trench warfare. Before you go, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next part of this epic journey. Every click helps us keep history alive and ensures these stories of courage and tragedy are never forgotten. Because history is not just about the past. It's about us, about who we are, and how we came to be. And World War I, the war that began with a single shot, still echoes in our world today.